just to introduce you, you're a physicist,
Right?
and a lot of hosts will bring up the fact that you worked for NASA for some time. But that's just one chapter of your incredible career. And what
Yes.
strikes me the most is that people who don't know, but a lot of my young viewers and listeners, a physicist is essentially a scientist who studies the movement of objects through space. Is that a fair approximation?
I generalize it even more than that. A physicist is someone who studies the nature of reality.
Oh,
That's what physics is all about. It's about, what is this real world? What is this physical world? How does it work? It's the fundamentals of the nature of reality. That's really what physics is. So, it's not just motion through space. That's a part of it. That's called dynamics.
dynamics. Yep.
And dynamics is a piece of physics. But there's other parts to it too that don't really have to do so much with motion as they just have to do with how things work.
Right.
That's the fundamental thing. And then physics is built on top of mathematics, because mathematics is really the logic of quantity. And then chemistry and biology, chemistry's next. It's built up on top of physics, and then biology is kind of built on top of chemistry. So those are all the hard sciences as they're called, but physics is kind of at the bottom of the pile as far as the sciences go, because we do the very fundamental stuff of reality and how does it work.
Right.
And then the biology and chemistry are kind of special applications into a specific field.
Right. Okay, great. So that's that. Thank you for that. Now, what really strikes me as fascinating is that while you study the world out there, you also were an explorer of the internal world, as people call it. But as it turns out, I have a feeling you're gonna expand on that concept as well.
Well, if you ask, you tell me what to talk about.
Oh, please. Yeah. No.
You go ahead and lead the show. It's your show, but
The wonderful thing
I'll
about you
follow.
is that you intuitively know exactly what people want to know, I think, because you are so curious. You're a scientist, and it's like just listening to you talk. I'm sure you hear this all the time. It's a host's dream is you could just take the show and take it places that I couldn't even dream. And so I just interviewed a 16-year-old boy who just flabbergasted me. He started a YouTube channel about 2 years ago, and in less than a year, he's up to 4,000 viewers, and he talks only about astral projection. And one of the things that was really interesting is that you don't find many teenagers nowadays who are into this kind of thing and thinking about the bigger picture. And the way he expresses himself, it reminds me of me and my friends when I was that age. And I must have been close to 10 or 11 back in the early 90s, which is like yesterday for you, but for me that's like a lifetime ago. And I remember discovering Art Bell, and that's when I first heard you. So you're like a big star celebrity to me. I'm really nervous, and I don't normally get nervous. So and talking about astral projection and Robert Monroe and all of this, and so I started learning to take trips out of the body with a sort of a margin of a degree of success way back then, and I've been doing it ever since. And one of the things that it's been such a gift for me is since my mother passed away when I was 25, I've been able to visit her and have real interactions with her, where when I come back to my body and wake up in the morning, I feel like I've been with my mother. And so it's a really beautiful tool for grief, I've discovered.
Yes,
So I'd love to take it into that theme, maybe to start of what the heck got a physicist like you involved with astral projection?
yeah, okay. We will go there. Are we rolling, and are you recording? Are we on live
Absolutely.
now? Are we? Okay. Um, okay. How did a nice guy like me end up in a place like this?
Yeah.
Yeah. How did a nice physicist like me end up in a place like this? Well, I guess it initially started when I was a graduate student, and I took some courses on TM, transcendental meditation. I saw an ad on the physics department door. They were all over the doors, all over the campus, and it promised that if you did TM, you would get by with less sleep. You would be more rested. And graduate students, particularly those like I was doing experimental nuclear physics, and you have big machines, big cyclotrons, and we had a big Van de Graaff generator, and these huge machines, when they're working and everything's flowing and the data is moving and everything is working, you don't quit because it's 5 o'clock and time to go home. You just keep those things going as long as they're going to go. So the equipment is one of the key things that you have to deal with when you're in experimental physics. So I would sometimes have to stay up 2 and 3 days at a time because my experiment was collecting data and I was working as long as the machine was running. So anything that could help me get by with less sleep sounded like a really good deal. So that was my initial motivation. But I found out, probably about 3 months into doing transcendental meditation, that I could debug my software, and programs. In those days, it was a lot harder to debug programs than it is now. In those days, the debugging was a very long and tedious process because things were written on punch cards, and you only maybe would get 1, maybe 2 if you were lucky, runs in a week from the one computer that served the entire university, and there were no PCs, you see. So it was a little different world then. So people spent a lot of time trying to find bugs and errors in their code.
Vacuum tubes and muskets and bear skins and stone knives.
Right, dinosaurs, roamed the earth, all of that at that time. So, as you dodged dinosaurs on the way to the computer room.
That's right.
If you had just one card out of place or one key punch error where the key punch was a little off and the hole wasn't quite where it was supposed to be, that may be the only computer run you'd get for a week. So anyway, I was debugging code and found out that I could debug it more accurately and quicker in my mind than I could looking at the code. I could be sitting at home in a meditation state, bring up the code, let it scroll by, and the lines that had problems in them would show up red, and the rest would show up black on white just like they were. And I could recognize the code because I wrote it all. So every line was mine. So as soon as I saw the line of code, I knew exactly what line that was in the 4,000 lines of code, which is small these days, but that's a lot of boxes of cards. But in those, it's like, actually I had 4 boxes and I think it's 4,000 cards per box, something like that. So it wasn't a big program as programs grow now, but it's a lot of holes in punch cards to keep track of. And so I was successful. I'd go up and look at that code, and sure enough, that's where the errors were. And it was a real thing that really worked. So that just changed my world totally, because I would, like any other young physicist, if you can't measure it, it either isn't important or it doesn't exist. That's just the way scientists look at the world. If the things you can't measure, then they're not really real. So when I had that experience, I knew that reality was a lot bigger than things you could measure. I knew there was another dimension to it, and being a physicist that wants to understand the nature of reality, my mind got very inquisitive. What's going on? What is this? How does it work? So I got real interested in it just from a theoretical viewpoint of wanting to know, how does it work? What is it? What are the limitations? What can it do? So I get out of graduate school, and within a few months of starting my first job, my boss tosses Bob Monroe's book, Journeys Out of Body, to me and asked me what I think about it. So I read the book, and I told him that, if this guy's just trying to sell books, he's got a good imagination. If it's real and he actually has had these experience, then I'm real interested, because that's like, here he has tapped into this larger reality that I'm very interested in. So eventually we realized that Bob's home was not that far away from where we worked, about a 45-minute drive. So we made an arrangement to go out to see him. And I wanted to know, is this guy just faking it? Is he making this up to sell books, or is he a real guy, really honest and straightforward? Well, I went out to see him, and I did find that he was a very honest, straightforward guy. I liked him because he was very engineerish, very all facts, and detail, and not a lot of I don't know what we call these days, touchy-feely stuff, or
woo-woo. I call it woo-woo.
Yeah, wasn't a lot of woo-woo stuff, but he was just kind of a facts guy. And his book was basically a diary. This is my experience, take it or leave it.
Well, and he
And
was also, if I'm correct about this, in those days, one of our very original True Blue radio guys. He was like a radio executive too,
he
and a media
was.
person.
He
Yeah.
was a radio guy. He had done that in earlier before he moved. He was in I think Richmond, Virginia, and
Mhm.
then he came to Charlottesville, Virginia, and he owned a cable company.
Mhm.
And this was, early days when cable was just the new thing on the block. There weren't a lot of cable companies, so he saw that as a coming thing. Bought into the market. Bought all the trucks and the cable and hired the people and started up a cable company there, and was very successful at it.
Now,
So
just as an aside, sorry to interrupt. Do you know if Bob Monroe had any influence from Edgar Cayce, whose foundation is in Virginia, and was a famous psychic in your country?
No, there wasn't a lot of influence there. I mean, he knew about Edgar Cayce, but Edgar Cayce had done a very different thing. Edgar Cayce, they called him the sleeping prophet. He would kind of lose consciousness, talk, people would write it all down, and then he'd wake up, and he often really wasn't aware of what it was he had been talking about.
Right.
Bob never lost consciousness. He was conscious before he went out of body. He was conscious during the transition. He was conscious afterwards. And when he came back, he did the same thing backwards. He was conscious in the transition and conscious he was back in the body. So he never, he was fully aware all the time. And that was a very different thing. And Cayce was down in Virginia Beach, which was a long way from Charlottesville, which is pretty much in the center of the state, more up in the Appalachian Mountain area
fair enough.
of Virginia. So in any case, no, there wasn't much of a connection there. So I go out to see Bob Monroe, and it turns out that he had just built this laboratory to study consciousness because he wanted to understand it. He didn't want it to be just some woo-woo thing, as you would say. He wanted it to be science. So he was looking for some scientists to help him study consciousness and try to figure out what this out-of-body thing really was. So, I'm a physicist. A friend of mine that was with me was an electrical engineer. So we volunteered. And Bob took us up on it. And our deal with him was that we'd be your, for free scientists, and we'd try to figure out what was going on best we could. We'd study it if you taught us how to go out of body like you do, because otherwise we would always be looking at it from the outside. And if you're always looking at something from the outside, you'll never really understand it. You have to experience it before you understand it. You can read 100 books on out of body, and if you've never been out of body, you just don't understand it, and you won't. And if you've been out of body once, you don't need 100 books. You know exactly, what's going on. So we didn't want to be in that position of looking in from the outside. So he agreed. So from then on, for the next 5 or 6, 7 years, Dennis and I spent 15 to 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe in his lab, and he was teaching us how to control our thoughts and go out of body. And probably 6 months later, we were doing it, and then probably a year later, we were completely able to do it whenever we wanted, kind of whenever we wanted. So we got very independent with it, just like he was.
And you're actually mentioned in one of his books, but not by name. You're called some kind of a code, like Physicist T or something, right?
It's TC Physicist.
TC Physicist.
Yeah, my initials, Thomas Campbell, TC Physicist. And yes, he talked about his explorers, which I was one of the first explorers. Then that came in, I think, in his second book, where he discussed the things that his explorers were doing. Anyway, so then I started to be able to do science, to do physics, if you will, in the non-physical, in the larger reality, because I could go whenever I wanted to. It was something that I could do on demand. And I eventually got to the point where I could do it very precisely, in that I could get back to the same place, the same state, over and over and over again. It wasn't just haphazard. A lot of people, when they do out of body, it just happens. It's spontaneous, and they don't really have a lot of control over, what they and where they end up or what they do. It's a thing that happens to them. But eventually, because I was working at this, 20 hours a week, about half-time job, I got to where I could always reproduce states pretty precisely, which gave me the ability to do science there. I could get in a state where I would have evidential things, like a remote viewing sort of thing, where you can go see if what you saw was actually what was there. So you can test it, a testable state, an evidential state.
Now, not to interrupt you here, Tom, but I wanted to just point out for the listeners and viewers, actually, because you and I know this already, but Bob Monroe's Institute not only attracted young scientists like yourself to come and experiment with this stuff, but even military officers were being sent at one point to be trained. And I just remember reading somewhere, and I don't have the exact cases on hand, but training individuals who were either institutionalized so they couldn't leave the walls of the institution to go out of body and see what was written on a piece of paper on a desk somewhere. It's like, this is what you mean when you're talking about evidential information, correct?
Right. There was lots of things we did that were evidential. Matter of fact, everything we did probably the first 3 years that we were there with Bob had to be evidential, because Dennis and I, he was the electrical engineer, Dennis and I were science types. We weren't easily going to be convinced that something was real until we had the data to show it. That's just the nature of the beast. So we had to have evidence, not just, oh, gee, that was interesting. It had to be, that was evidential. So yes, Bob would write numbers on blackboards after we were in our booths. So we'd go look at future headlines in newspapers. We would heal. We would remote view. We would do everything basically that we could think of that was evidential, and then we'd check out the evidence.
That had an impact and a connection to the physical world. So now, can you, I hate to play host here, but just for my listeners and viewers, was there one thing in particular for you that you experienced in the early days that really blew you away, that convinced you? Like, what was that first thing or that one thing that might have turned it?
Well, we had in, a year or two developed basically our statistics of the probability. It's like, when you do statistics, you have a thing that you do that tells you how likely your result is to not be chance. Either you're just a good guesser and it was just chance, good luck you got that 7-digit number, right, with all 7 digits. But you can reduce that to mathematics and say, what's the probability that you can guess that number and you just got it right because this was your lucky day? And that called statistical significance, whether what you're doing is significant or whether it could just be chance. So our statistical significance, that what we were doing was real. We were really tapping into information that otherwise was not available to us in the physical world through normal physical means. And it was, 100,000 to 1, 10,000 to 1. The statistics were just huge. And basically in science, if you have 100 to 1, that what you're getting is by chance, that's pretty good. And 1,000 to 1 is really excellent. That's where the really strong science starts, is about 1,000 to 1. And anything above that is just, almost, you would call it an objective fact, though it's not actually an objective fact. It's still subjective and it's still statistical, but it becomes something that scientists really wouldn't argue with. Well, we were probably 10,000, 100,000, or greater to 1. So it was clear that we had what we were doing was real. That what we had been able, because we weren't just doing it haphazardly, we were doing it because we intended to, and when we intended to. And it was not, 10% of the time, it was, 90% of the time we would get things right. So we knew it was a strong scientific case for this is real, but neither Dennis nor I could really say this is real. Because we were scientists and we would always be thinking, well, okay, but, maybe there's some other reason that we just don't understand yet. That's, some physical thing going on here that we just haven't discovered, and we weren't quite sold. So the one event that basically transferred this knowledge from my intellect down to my gut, to the being level for me, was when Dennis and I went out on an out-of-body together. It was an idea of Bob's, and he's told us to meet up above the lab and stick together. And just always, that was the key idea, always stick together. You could go wherever you wanted, but both of you go together through this thing. So we did. And it was a long adventure, a very, if the adventure had been something like we sat in a gray cloud the whole time, well, there's nothing evidential there. There's nothing that you could say about it. But it wasn't like that at all. We went places, we saw things, we talked to individuals, we had conversations among ourselves, we talked with others. And when all that was done, Bob had recorded what we said, because what we would do in the lab, so Bob could understand where our minds were, so he could coach us. We had this microphone that was just a few inches from our lips, suspended from the ceiling. We were in soundproof booths, separated by another empty soundproof booth, and we would be telling Bob the things we were seeing, what we were doing, what the conversation was about. So we just had this stream of consciousness going on all the time. And he trained us to do it that way. Otherwise, he couldn't have helped us very much. So he had these audio recordings, and he turned them both on at the same time. So they were in sequence. They were timed right. And there was Dennis and I answering each other's questions, talking to other individuals, pointing out things that we saw. And there was just a lot of evidential stuff that couldn't be explained in any other way other than we were both there out of body together seeing the same things. So now that kind of was dramatic for me, because otherwise you could always have some sort of hallucination, but for two people to be sharing the same hallucination like that is kind of stretching it a bit.
And not able to hear each other between the soundproof rooms. That's the thing.
Right. No, we were totally isolated in these booths. Yeah. Matter of fact, one of the booths, I don't think all three of them, but one of them at least, was also electromagnetically shielded. It was a grounded Faraday cage. In other words, it was totally wrapped in metal, which was then grounded metal, so that no electromagnetic waves could go in or out. It was an isolated from all electromagnetic radiation. So that was the booth I was in, and Dennis, then we skip a booth, but these were acoustically isolated from each other. And had Dennis or I screamed as loud as we could, the other person probably could have heard a little muffled noise. The acoustic isolation was good, but we weren't screaming. We were in an altered state of consciousness. We were just barely talking.
Yeah.
We were just whispering at a very low volume. So it was obviously physically impossible for us to have heard each other. But even if it did, there were things we saw. It wasn't just hearing. Oh, do you see that thing over there? You mean the thing, with this and that and the ball on top? Yeah, that's the one, and what about this other thing that is attached to that goes over there, and oh, you mean this or that? So we were obviously seeing the same things and could talk about them in such a way that it was clear we were both there together. So yeah, that hit me like a ton of bricks. That was the experience that moved it out of my intellect down into the being level. And after that, I stopped asking, is it real? I knew it was real, and that was no longer an interesting question to me. Is it real? So that's, I think, the way it is for everybody. At first, you have experiences, but you're not quite sure they're real, But eventually, maybe you'll get one that is so unexplainable any other way that there's nothing else to do but realize that it is indeed real, and you might as well accept that fact.
My father's an engineer type and very skeptical. He's very supportive of the work I do as a medium, but he's like, people seem to be helped by what you do, bro. So keep doing it. That's about as far as he goes. But even he had an experience he couldn't explain, which really opened his mind when he was much younger. He and my mother woke up one morning and they could tell each other what they were both dreaming because they shared a dream. And it had just floored both of them. It was one of the biggest paranormal experiences other than having me, I would say. And I actually experienced that after my mother died. I had a friend who I hadn't spoken to in somewhat like 10 years from another province here in Canada. I wake up, first thing I get is an email from him, and he's describing the dream I just had. And he was in it with me. And that was when I remembered my parents' experience. I'm like, whoa, like this is crazy. So I can attest that kind of a thing can happen. And when it does, it's like reality shattering, or maybe reality restructuring is a better word for it.
Sure. Well, that happens to a lot of people. They will have experiences that they cannot explain, but they know it was a real experience. Sometimes they will doubt their own experience. They will say, I must be going crazy, or insane. I must have made all that up. Bob Monroe did that when he first started having out of bodies. He thought maybe he was mentally ill. He didn't know. It just was something happening to him. He went to a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and said, am I insane, or what's going on in my head? And they said, no, you're perfectly sane. There's nothing that we can see that's abnormal in your head. And that's when Bob said, well, if these things are going to keep happening to me, I guess I ought to start exploring them, start to play with them and see what. I said he was kind of like an engineer mentality, he wanted to figure things out. That's why he built the lab. He wanted to figure things out. So he just played with it. And at first it scared him. He thought that there was some kind of problem with his mind. But anyway, where I was going before is that when I had stability in this state, I could do research there. I could go into the state, do something evidential like we were talking about, and then I could go in again and change one variable and try to do that evidential thing again, or one like it. And did that change make a difference or not? Well, I could then change, another variable. And did that make a difference? So you could start looking at all the variables that were involved and seeing which variables did what to, the outcome of the experiment. Which ones made it easier to, read those numbers on the board, which ones made it more difficult or impossible. So that's how I learned some about the nature of consciousness and what worked and what didn't and why it worked and what blocked it and what aided it and where were the limitations, that sort of thing. And I did that for about, 35 years. I'm doing this exploration and this tedious scientific work of how does this affect it? And what does that mean? And trying to come up with some kind of model that made sense of how it all worked together. And I did this through most of the 1990s, I guess. It took me 5 years to write the books. After 35 years of research, I wrote these books, and they were to be a theory of consciousness, how consciousness worked.
And that's My Big Toe trilogy.
And
is
that's
that right?
the My Big Toe trilogy. And I'd published that My Big Toe trilogy as a model of consciousness, although I had known one of the facts that I had learned then was that consciousness is fundamental. The physical world is not. It's a derivative of the consciousness world. That was a fact that I learned. I learned a lot of facts about the consciousness world as I was doing this research. I pulled out a bunch of things that I had enough experimentation and enough experience to say, yeah, that's a fact. That's how things work. So I knew the physical world was not the fundamental world and that consciousness was the fundamental world, but I didn't really know what to do with that fact until about 2 years after the book was published. I got an aha moment that someone triggered, that I realized, the very same concepts that is explaining consciousness will also do a much better job at explaining quantum physics. The double slit experiment in particular, it's that weird experiment that no physicist really understands why it works that way. So I suddenly got the idea, well, I know why it works that way. It works that way because consciousness works this way. They were connected. And then I started looking at other things, and I realized that quantum physics has a whole set of paradoxes, things that the scientists know it's like this, reality is like this, but they have no idea why it should be like that. And my consciousness truths, my conscious model could explain all of that quantum mechanics, resolve all of those paradoxes. So then I said, well, gee, if I'm doing so well here in quantum physics, what about the other big mystery in science? And that's, why is the speed of light a constant? That's the key idea in relativity. Once you know that the speed of light's a constant, then relativity falls out with a little bit of algebra. It's not that hard. It's just a logical deduction from that fact that the speed of light's always a constant. No matter what the velocity of its source is, it's always a constant. And then that in about a week popped out as that was perfectly clear. It falls out of the same model of consciousness. So then I started looking for other things. And 2 or 3 months later, I had solved all the major paradoxes that I knew of in science. Even had a real good idea about the fundamental nature of chaos and why chaos theory worked the way it worked. So all these things kind of resolved themselves. And, I should have gotten that a lot quicker. I'm a physicist. I should have seen that, a lot sooner. But like I say, it was a couple of years after I published the books that I got the idea. So then a year or two ago, in October 2016, a couple of years ago, I put together a set of experiments, quantum mechanics experiments, that would kind of validate this approach that I was taking, my kind of a consciousness approach to physics, if you will. And those experiments, and I outlined in a talk in Los Angeles, California, in October 2016. And if anybody goes to my YouTube site and they look for MBT-LA, so MBT is my big toe dash LA for Los Angeles, then 2016. So MBT LA 2016, they will get this presentation of mine. Since then, I've raised money to actually do those experiments, and hopefully this next year, 2019, we'll see them done. And wow. If that's the case, we will have a set of straight up physics, quantum mechanics experiments that will very strongly validate or add evidence to what my model of consciousness says and the nature of reality, and a whole new way of looking at science and physics that will solve many of the problems that we have. So it's liable to be a big sea state change in the way we see ourselves and the world. So that's, so that's kind of where I started as a graduate student, and now I'm got these physics experiments I'd like to get done. And the money that I got to do those experiments was crowdfunding. I did a Kickstarter program and got about $250,000, 236, I think it was, $236,000 to do it. And I'm in the process now of trying to find physicists and universities and so on to do that.
Now, aside from, of course, it being, the 1970s and 80s back then, and there being no crowdfunding, if there had been crowdfunding, do you think you would have been able to raise that kind of money at that time for this type of a subject? I think there's been a change.
Yes, there has been. It's gained, these ideas have spread much more wider throughout our population and are much more credible than they were then. Now, back in the early 60s, late 60s, where Bob wrote the book, in the early 70s when I got out to see Bob, that was like 72. 71, 72 is when I met Bob and started working at his lab. So sort of late 60s, early 70s through middle 70s. That was a time when people were very open-minded. 70s was a time of new ideas. So a lot of people were embracing new ideas. And like you say, that's when even the CIA embraced the idea of remote viewing. So people were more open-minded then. And then we got into the 80s and 90s, and most of that turned around and went the other way. And now it's turned around again and is getting more and more open. And these ideas have more traction now than they used to. So yes, the only reason that the crowdfunding worked is partly because I've had this website going. Every time I give a talk, and the talk you and I are having is going to end up on my YouTube channel, I've probably got 2,000 hours of me talking there. It's pretty intimidating if you go to there first. But anyway, I've got around 44,000 subscribers, and I don't know how many million views, 4, 5, 6 million views. So that spread the word around a lot about me and my experiments and so on. And 40,000 people just contributing $10 a piece makes a lot of money.
Yep.
You
Yep.
know, so
So it's not a lot of investment for them, but it's like you're contributing to something phenomenal. I say this often with my work, and I think you've definitely entered this territory. I just don't think they have PhDs for what we're doing yet.
yes. Well, what we're doing is very foreign to most science. You know, most science is based strictly in the objective world. That's where I came from as a young physicist who, before I started the TM. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, or if it actually does exist somehow, it's not important. If it's not measurable, it's not a real thing. So science limits itself just to the objective, measurable world. Well, if you think about it, listeners, think about yourself. Think about what's important to you. Think about the things that are meaningful, things that are significant in your life. And if you do, you probably will find that it's not the objective stuff that holds particular meanings. They're like the props on the stage. You know, what's really going on, what's important, your relationships, the love, the caring, the joy. None of those things are objective. They're all subjective things. So if you look at your life and your experience and you say, well, what's important? What's necessary? What is significant? And you will find that the objective part, the part that science says is real, is some minor part that, like I say, it's like the props on the stage. It's not really where the action is. It's not what's important. It's not what's significant. So now we're going to have science saying that this little piece of things that aren't very significant is really all that reality is about. Nonsense. There's a whole lot more to being alive and being a human, or even being a dog or a cat, than the objective stuff in the world. So that's kind of a very limiting viewpoint. But scientists have limited themselves to that viewpoint because they came from the bad old days when the subjective world was run by the high priests of religion, and basically it was kind of arbitrary. Whatever those high priests said, that was reality, and there didn't have to be any experiments or any logic to back it up or any mathematics to back it up. It just was because I told you so. And they didn't like that. They said, no, we're not going to believe anything until we see the data, till we do the experiment. So
I love this analogy that you use. I'm sorry to interrupt.
It was a new way of looking at things is where we came from. You're going to talk about the high priest analogy?
You must be psychic or something.
Yeah.
I love that because you've been using this analogy lately about today's high priests are the media scientists, among other scientists. Like I've been emailing Michael Shermer and he doesn't really respond to me, but I've been talking to him about maybe starting a dialogue about how, listen, there's scientists who study this and they study the paranormal and psychic phenomena objectively. And yet people like him are going out in the media and saying it's not possible. This stuff just doesn't exist. And it's because I said so. He has no reason that's relevant even to dismiss it.
He has no logic, but what he has is a belief. Yes, the high priests of Western culture now are the scientists. It's the scientists that tell us what to believe. So if something comes up and people wonder, is that true? Well, the scientists are the ones to resolve that issue. They'll tell you whether it's true or not. So we believe what the scientists tell us. Well, then we have to ask, what do the scientists believe? You see, it was just like with the high priests of religion back, 400 or 500 years ago. Well, the high priest of religion told everybody else what to believe. But then you have to say, well, what did the high priest believe? What was the basis of their belief? Well, the high priests of Western culture, the scientists, they believe in materialism. They believe in the objective material world, and that's it. That's all there is. That's all there ever has been. Everything else is a hallucination. And if you are a materialist, you also have to believe that there is no choice. You have to be a determinist because materialism is deterministic. That's the kind of the Newton universe is a machine kind of an idea. Our biology, we are just machines, and the universe is a machine, and machines always do, give a machine the same input and it'll always give you the same output. So there really are no choices. It's just the facts of science make everything work the way they work. So scientists believe that. And when you point out to them some good research that shows that paranormal things, can be researched with really good quality science, they just simply dismiss it because it is impossible according to their beliefs. They don't have to study it. They don't have to look at the research. They don't have to do anything else. It's impossible because it conflicts with their belief. So that's as far as they will go. And basically, any believer does the same thing. If something conflicts with their belief, either they brush it off or they deny it. It's just what believers do. You see, when you're a believer, you don't think that what you believe is a belief. You think that what you believe is a fact. That's what makes you a believer. You think your beliefs are facts. Whether those are religious beliefs or social beliefs or scientific beliefs, doesn't make any difference. You believe your beliefs are facts. And when something comes up that says your belief isn't right, well, that's anomalous data. Those people don't know what they're talking about. It's people are making this up, trying to get attention. You make up all kinds of things that allow you to dismiss it because that that can't possibly be true. So that's kind of the trouble that the paranormal researchers have had over the last almost 100 years.
It's ironic, isn't it, that we paranormal researchers are the ones being accused of having a belief, and we're yet the ones confronting people with beliefs.
Yes, exactly. That's just the way it works, you see. So I think, though, that we're in for a change. I think the physicists are going to lead this change in a sense because they are the high priests and they do define what's real. We're getting to a point where the physicists have backed themselves into a corner with their own experiments. With their own experiments, they have found that this is not a materialistic reality, that materialism doesn't work. It won't get the right answers. It doesn't compute for them. It's wrong. And what they find that works, that our reality is information based. If you look at our reality not as stuff, but as information, that does compute. They can then compute the right answers, to that experiments.
Starts to fill in the gaps of all these experiments. Yeah.
So that's been going on now for 100 years. Though the majority of physicists still have their head in the sand and saying, no, that's impossible. Materialism is it. This is a deterministic materialist world. They say that even, just because that's what they believe. But physics experiments have been contrary to that and saying, no, that's not right, for about 100 years, starting with the double slit experiment. And they're going on and on and on. Every year, there's dozens of experiments that are done that show that a material reality just doesn't cut it. It doesn't work. It's a bad model. And that this is, as an information-based reality, is a good model. So physicists, as Planck, I think it was Planck, Max Planck said that concepts in physics change one funeral at a time.
I love that quote.
Yeah, that was because they were running into the early days of quantum physics, Bohr and Einstein and Planck and Heisenberg and Wigner.
And Bohr and Planck are the ones who came up with the first theories of the black holes. Is that right?
No, the first theories of black holes was a guy called John Archibald Wheeler. He was one of the first to do that, and he was also a really good physicist. I'd say in the last, after Einstein, and he was with that group. Wheeler was in there with that Einstein and the Bohr and the Heisenbergs, but he was a young guy then. He was one of the junior guys. Well, after the senior guys all passed on and he came into his own, he probably was the single greatest physicist around. And he's the one not only that came up with the idea and the concept and the terminology for black holes, he also decided that this was an information-based reality. He said, kind of quoting Wheeler, he said that when he started in physics, he thought that everything was material. that it was all physical, and it was, the physical reality was the thing, and he was a materialist. He says then he realized that that wasn't true. It couldn't possibly be true because of the experiments. And then he thought everything was waves. It was all about wave motion and wave things. And then after about a decade of that, he realized that couldn't be true either. And he finally realized it was all about information. And he's the one that came up with the little sound bite, it from bit, which it being the universe from a bit, from information. So that was also John Wheeler. So yeah, he was one of the best. And many of his graduate students were the ones that then later became the big guns in the physics world. And along John Wheeler did himself. And Wheeler did a lot of very seminal experiments that also kind of showed that information was the core. Now, Wheeler died in something close to the year 2000, maybe 2001 or 2 or 3, something like that, early 2000s, when he died at a very old age. But anyhow, yes, science is coming to the point where the younger guys coming on aren't so opposed to the idea of an information-based reality. Another term for that is a simulated reality. And another equivalent term for that is a virtual reality. It's a computed reality is what they mean when they say it's an information-based reality. So that is kind of the biggest idea that's been growing in physics. A decade ago, there was maybe a dozen physicists who thought virtual reality was anything but insane. And now you have people who think virtual reality is the answer, that this is an information-based reality in physics departments everywhere. It's growing. And it's interesting to me that's where it's growing is at the top. It's not growing, in the cornflake, university somewhere, unknown. It's growing in the MITs and, the physicists at CERN and the people at Cambridge. And, if you look around the world, it's the very cream of the crop, top Caltechs, it's those folks is where you'll find groups of physicists who think virtual reality is the right answer. So that's, to me, is showing a kind of a sign of where we're going. So physics is moving in that direction. And in another decade or decade after that, I think that large minority will turn into a majority. And most of the physicists will be thinking that. And at that point, this idea of materialism is just going to go away as a neat idea for a little while, but it failed, to really deliver the goods.
It'll take the turn of leeches in medical science, pretty much, which actually we find were pretty useful things, but not quite what they thought, or like sticking herbs in a mask to protect you from viruses, which also tends to work, but not as well as they thought. So,
right. Well, in that time, bleeding somebody was part of the cure, because all things tended to reduce down to bad blood, and well, you get some of that bad blood out, then maybe you could make some better blood and recover. So. Right. When you're very ill and very weak, they'd cut you and let you bleed out a pint or so, which is not exactly on your way to better health. It just added a lot of extra stress to the body that probably weakened your immune system and everything else that made stuff worse. But,
hey, talk about reductionist science, right?
Yes.
Bleed your patients out.
Yeah. So that was an idea then. But yeah, we are getting more and more away from materialism. And as we get away from materialism and determinism, that starts opening up science into a bigger viewpoint than just objective stuff, than just the material world. So I think we are getting closer, and in the near future, we'll get there to the point where scientists will say, yes, this is a virtual reality. This is a computed reality. Now, they won't be meaning to start a conceptual revolution. They'll just think they're doing good science. But when they say that, it's going to be out of their hands, because once the high priests say that, then it's not going to be lost on the rest of the world that, okay, this is a computed reality. Where is it being computed? Who's computing it? What's going on? Because to have a computed reality, the reality can't compute itself. It's got to come from somewhere else, some other reality frame other than the computed one. Has to be the one that computes, you see. So this suddenly, with a little trivial logic, says that there is something else that is more fundamental, more significant, bigger, you might say, than us. And we are a result of that thing, whatever it is. We're a simulation. The simulator has to be non-physical to us. You see, because when you're in a simulated world, the world you're in is just the world of that simulation, and that seems physical to you, and anything outside of that world would seem non-physical to you. So from our perspective, this bigger thing of which we are a subset is non-physical. Well, that just opens the floodgates to all sorts of things. It opens the floodgates to all the things paranormal that have been studied suddenly become real science, because there's this non-physical world that is a more fundamental thing than our physical world. And it opens the floodgates to religions of all sorts who will be trying to claim that their God is a better programmer than somebody else's God. And, there's a lot of stuff is going to happen. So the physicists won't mean to start a social revolution and a theological revolution, and a social revolution, but they probably will anyway without knowing it. And the thing is, they're the only ones that can start it because they are the high priests. Unless the high priests tell us something, we're not going to believe it. So, we've had, goodness, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha said that our reality was an illusion. Well, that's like saying it's a virtual reality. It's not the main thing. It's just an illusion. So we've known this, back before, writing and history occurred, because all it takes to find this out is a consciousness exploring itself. That's where the information comes from. So we've known this in the margins for a long time, but it's never gotten out of the margins. It's always stayed off on the sidelines.
Well, talking about black holes, look, we did not have Hubble telescope. We did not have any visual evidence of black holes. It was completely dreamed up conceptually within the consciousness of these physicists. So they're able to theorize things that we then decades later look out into space and go, oh, look, there it is. And it looks exactly like they predicted it would.
Right.
How the hell did they do that through just going in here? And
it fit. They understand. See, what science does is it discovers the rules in the rule set. This is a computed reality. A computed reality is computed according to a rule set. Your World of Warcraft or The Sims, those games have a rule set. Your Sims person can't just leap up into the air and fly like Superman. The rules don't allow your Sims guy to do that. It has rules, and you have to abide by those rules. Well, our reality is the same way, and the job of science is to discover what are the rules in the rule set. So they looked at the rules in the rule set. Okay, gravity. When gravity gets bigger, it starts pulling things into it, which makes it even bigger, which pulls more things into it, which makes it even bigger. And you just follow that logic, and pretty soon you have something so big that has so much gravitational force that light cannot escape, because light is also a little particle affected by gravity. And then if light can't escape, guess what color it is? It's black. So they just looked at the rule set and came up with that should exist. And then they do a lot more of the logical consequences of that and so on. And then eventually, sure, they find them. They find these black holes, because that's just the nature of our rule set. So it's you expect science to be able to make those kinds of predictions. But what science has done is that they don't know all the rules. They've thought that it was a material reality, and they were digging out the facts of materialism. And they find out that that was wrong. It was a wrong idea. That was Newton's idea. And they've really had a hard time letting go of Newton and the Newton viewpoint. Now we've been doing quantum mechanics for almost 100 years, and quantum mechanics told us that this was not the case. This was not a materialistic reality. It was a probabilistic reality. Quantum mechanics is basically a probabilistic theory of existence. But somehow, just like scientists who also are religious can carry two things that are totally logically incompatible with each other around and put a separator between them and pretend that there's no conflict. Well, that's what physicists have been doing. They've had Newton has been disproved as far as a fundamental idea. The clockwork universe, the materialist universe, has been dead since the early 1920s when quantum mechanics said, it doesn't work that way. But science has been carrying around anyway, and they put this, this divider between, their beliefs and what their experiments say, and then justify it that, well, okay, we just don't understand it yet, but it's bound to be true. We just don't see how. And yeah, it looks like a conflict, but I'm sure it isn't once we understand. So it's that sort of thing. And as it turns out, no, it's not correct. And the only way to understand it is to see that it is a virtual reality. Now, and that was what my theory of consciousness did. My theory of consciousness led me to the fact that this was a information-based reality, that consciousness is information. And I came from a theory of consciousness into this idea of the reality being information-based. And then, during that decade after I published, a lot of physicists kind of joined me in this idea, but from a totally different perspective. So we're all kind of, converging on this idea. But once the high priests let that cat out of the bag, they'll not be able to stuff it back inside. And I think it'll start a ball rolling that nobody will be able to stop until it has made very serious changes to our concepts of who we are, why we're here, and what's the point.
Well, this is very exciting. It's very exciting. And to spiral out a little bit now, you've been exploring that realm in a very deep and fundamental way for 30 years. And I think we are heading into the meat and potatoes of this interview, which is what it all essentially means, what you've discovered from it. And you started to touch on love and experience in your day-to-day life, and how that is somehow tied to and reflective of your true self. And versus fear and ego and what that all might mean. And I know I don't want to get ahead and put words in your mouth here, but this is really the core and the chunk. And I'd love for you to expand on any of your discoveries.
Yes, it is. It is. And it was kind of unexpected. I'm a science guy, and it was very kind of another one of those ahas, actually more, and also a laugh and a chuckle, when I realized that many of the things that are very core, fundamental to religions actually turned out to be true. And that was like, really, I didn't expect that. I had a very low opinion of religion, being a science guy, and it was like, yeah, those religions, they believe anything, and they sucker people, with fear and this and that. So I had this really negative attitude toward all religions. But then I find out that much of their fundamentals, not their dogma, not their rituals, not that stuff, but a lot of their fundamentals are really fundamentally true. They're right. That is the way the world works. But I didn't get there from a religious viewpoint. I didn't get there from a feel-good viewpoint. It wasn't like, love's the answer. That sounds good. It's warm and fuzzy. Let's go with that. It's not that at all. I got to that through science, through logic. The way it works is information systems are composed, or what we say, information systems have a thing called entropy. Okay, entropy is a physics term for a measure of disorganization. So if I have a bunch of bits and all the bits are random, there is no organization. That's what random means. If all the bits are random, there is no information. As the bits get ordered, that creates information, because order creates information. Example, up, down, up, down, up, down. What's next? Well, it's going to be an up, right? Because that's a pattern. I've created a pattern. A pattern has information. It shows you can predict where the next part of that pattern is going to go. So in any case, order creates information. Order that's meaningful and useful and significant, creates more information, useful information, usable information. So if we have an information system, this information evolves, grows, becomes by lowering its entropy. Okay, now consciousness as an information system. And that's not so hard to understand, because if we took the information away from you, what is your information you get? You get information through your senses. You have 5 senses. You see, you smell, you hear, you taste, and you touch. And that creates your reality. Take all of that, and that's just information. Your senses are just data collectors. Your senses are really sensors, and they collect information. Take that information away, and what happens to your world? It disappears. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't touch it, you can't hear it, you can't taste it. What is it? It disappears. It's gone. Your world, your reality is nothing but information that you collect through your senses. So the fact that reality is information is not is not really a big leap. Once you take your senses away, what's left? What's left is you are a point of consciousness floating in a void. That's what's left. You're left in what I call the Descartes moment. I am, therefore I think, or I think, therefore I am. You're just a piece of point consciousness, aware that you exist. And that's all that's left when you get rid of all the information, your consciousness. So consciousness is more fundamental. Take away all the information, what's left is awareness, is consciousness. And this is basically where Descartes ended up after his exhaustive, search, 200 years ago or however long that was, is that you get back to the point where existence, being aware, being conscious is the fundamental thing. If you strip away everything else, that's the fundamental. Okay, so what is consciousness? Consciousness is an awareness. Consciousness communicates. It interacts with other consciousness. In our system, there's lots of conscious beings. That cat that's wandering around in your house there, and dogs and horses and bumblebees, and there's all kinds of things that are conscious. And to be conscious, all you have to do is make choices, real choices, free will choices. If you can make a choice, then you're conscious. Okay, so rocks aren't conscious because they don't make choices. Trees, we don't know yet. They're in that gray area. It looks like they may be aware, but they may not make choices. They kind of show awareness of things, but we don't know that yet. So there's a gray area where it's hard to tell, whether something is conscious or not, because they could just be hardwired. They're not making choices. They're just running through algorithms, and that's the result. There's a clam, and the clam has its foot out, and you touch its foot, and it jerks its foot in. Well, is that because it's made a choice? Oh, something hit my foot, I better pull it in. Or is it just hardwired? When something hits its foot, the algorithm says, something hit my foot, pull it in. It's not a thought, it's just hardwired in the DNA, and it just does it because it's hardwired. So those are two different ways of acting. One's hardwired and one is thoughtful, and that separates conscious from not conscious. So there's a gray area where we're not really sure whether some things are conscious or not, but other things are clear that are conscious. That cat makes choices, and it makes choices. You can tell it has personality, and it thinks about things, comes to decisions, makes a choice, and executes that choice, and it's pretty clear that it's conscious. So consciousness interacts. And when you have an interactive thing, and that's basically what it does, it deals in information. It's an information system. Okay, so you get pieces of consciousness, and they can interact with each other. When you have all these pieces of consciousness, and I'm going to skip the part of how we end up with all the pieces of consciousness, it's a longer story, but just say we have all these individuated units of consciousness interacting with each other, what you have is a social system. And then logic will show you that a social system will optimize itself when all of the individuals in that social system care about each other. When in a social system, all the individuals in the system care about themselves, you end up with a very suboptimal system. Here's an example. Take two groups of individuals, basically equal. We'll give each one a certain amount of resources, and then we will let group A, which is fear-based, it's all about them. Okay, fear is an individual thing. Fear is self-focused. Fear is about what you're afraid of. The other group is love-based. Love is about other. How can I help? How can I serve? Whereas the fear group is what can I get and how can I keep it? Okay, so they both have the same amount of resources, and say there's 10,000 of them and you give them a lot of resources and see what they do with it. Well, in the fear group, because you have fear, you don't have trust. You can't trust people because you don't know what their motivations are. So if you're big, then you take stuff away from those that are small because you want it, and it's really all about you. It's not about them. And then, because people might take your stuff away, you form alliances with other people to protect each other. And these alliances grow, and other people form alliances, and now the alliances fight with each other to get each other's stuff and to make sure that the other group isn't going to take your stuff, and so on it goes. And if somebody in this fear group comes up with a really good idea, really understands something useful, they don't share it with everybody. They keep it to themselves so that they can benefit from it, so they can sell it, or they can make products that sell, or they can just let them get ahead but keep other people down, because what's important is that you get most of the stuff. You're trying to get all the marbles that you can get and keep them. So in any case, if you let that go to its natural conclusion, you'll end up with a very few people owning all of the stuff, controlling all the stuff. The 5% control everything. The 95% are the peasants. They're at the bottom of the barrel because it
sounds familiar.
Yeah, because it becomes hierarchical right away in these hierarchies of self-protection groups and who's in charge and who makes the rules and so on. And you end up with what we live in, with our world, right? It's a fear-based world. Now you take the other world where everybody is trying to optimize by what service can I provide? How can I help? That group will figure out how to optimize those resources for everyone. And after the same amount of time that this other group ends up with 5% in charge and the rest, in poverty, the group that is love-based has optimized all the resources for everybody. And right away, people who are used to living in a fearful world will say, nah, that doesn't work, because as soon as you have this collective thing, some people get more important than others, and pretty soon you end up with a totalitarian, fascist government anyway, because that's what happens here when we've done this collective things. We have collective things, and they always end up, like in the story, some pigs, are more than others, so some animals are more important than other animals. I guess it's the pigs that were in charge in that book. But anyway, so yeah, it works out that way. And the reason it works out that way is because the people are fearful. The individuals in it are fearful, you see. So yes, they're in this collective, but really it's really all about them. They're really self-focused and self-centered. So it degenerates into a fascist state. Well, in a group where all the people are not fearful, they care about each other. Now you're going to optimize everybody's choices. No, you won't become a slave to the majority. If you're unhappy, everybody in that majority will want to make you happy because they truly and honestly care about you and what you're doing. So if you say, well, I don't like building cars, I'd rather be a poet. Well, they'll say, great, go work on that. We'll support you while you, take some English courses and so on. Go work on that. We need poets. That's a good thing to do. And somebody else will want to build cars, or they'll work out some other way to do it. So everybody gets to do pretty much what they want. You don't get stuck in these little treadmills, these little channels, troughs that you get stuck in. So you're a brain surgeon, and if you want to be a brain surgeon, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and go be a forester or pick up garbage on the back of a truck on Tuesdays, Thursdays, that's fine. You get that outside physical work that makes you feel strong and better and keeps you healthy, and then you get that technical work, fixing brains, and that entertains you too. You don't have to just get stuck in a thing. Okay, I ride on the back of a garbage truck, and that's all I can do. I operate on brains, and that's all I can do. Anybody that does the same thing over and over and over again gets kind of tired of it and bored with it.
Sounds like
And
a Renaissance era, like Leonardo da Vinci, who was a great artist, but also an inventor, and also one of the first
right.
people to accurately draw the human anatomy. So, experimenting, like you said, with surgery. I'm having somewhat of a realization as you're talking, and I thought I'd share it with you. Which is, I've been reading the Gulag Archipelago, and of course, this was based on what you're talking about, where you have fascist sort of communist regimes that are fear-based. And what's so touching about it is, even in those regimes, you have stories of individuals taking care of each other within the labor camps. And so it seems as though love and compassion are almost fundamental to all humans, no matter what group they appear to belong to, even if they're under the tyranny of a fear-based leadership.
Yes, that's exactly right, because we are consciousness. We're not bodies. We are consciousness playing a body, if you will, an avatar. The body is the avatar. We're the consciousness. Consciousness is an information system. Information systems evolve by lowering their entropy, by creating more information. And because this is a social system, the way a social system full of consciousness lowers its entropy is by caring about each other. So the way the consciousness system evolves is by caring, by each of its units becoming more and more love-like, caring-like. So that is our nature. It's where we're going. That is evolution. When we become more and more self-focused, that's de-evolution, and we're de-evolving.
Now, just to
And
stay on this for a quick second here, a
okay,
lot of psychologists nowadays will say that, there are people who are a little more higher in trait openness and are more likely to care about others, whereas there are some who are very self-centered and disagreeable. They call it trait disagreeableness. And the people who are disagreeable have been shown statistically to get raises and promotions more often and succeed in the world. And I'm reminded of a certain president who you might be familiar with as well. And so, but here's the thing: spiritual teachers, and something I realized when I was younger from my own experiments and experiences, is that it doesn't feel as good when you're being loved as it does to give love. Like giving love and being kind actually is the gift to the giver. And I always think of this kid I knew in high school who, we'll call him Melvin, and he was very depressed, and he sat in the back of the class. He was very unfortunate, very skinny boy, big acne, zits, and everything. And he just came to school for one reason every day. In math class, he sat behind Melanie, who was the star cheerleader, and he was just head over heels in love with her. I don't even think she knew he existed. And yet she was the reason he got up and got through school every day. And I found out later, many years, that Melanie was in an abusive relationship with the star football player of the school. And so Melanie didn't know she was being loved. But Melvin got tears in my eyes. Melvin got through his career in high school, which was very difficult because of Melanie. And so love is the gift of the lover. And when I think you might speak to this too, you can learn to become a better receiver of love as well in life. But if there are people out there who are more selfish, going, this all sounds great, but what's in it for me? Well, actually, there is something in it for you to be less selfish and more loving. It's like it will make your existence better, because as it turns out, maybe love is what you are, and you're just denying that.
yeah. Well, absolutely. That is the case. So here we are, individuated units of consciousness. The way we evolve is to become love. Okay, now how do we do that? Well, what is conscious? We make choices, we interact. So all of the choices we make are choices that are either toward caring, toward love, or they're toward self-centeredness or fear. You see, so by our choices, we change who we are. And that's why this simulator had to be created. We're in this virtual reality, computed simulation, because the simulation produces a lot of choices, meaningful choices, choices with consequences that we didn't have when we were just in the big chat room, sharing information. There weren't a lot of consequences. There wasn't a lot of choices that made a big difference to anybody. So we create this consciousness, creates this virtual reality, doesn't program it, lets it evolve. It evolves. And as it evolves, and it evolves things that make choices, then we get to log on to play those avatars that make those choices. And by doing so, we get to make some real serious life and death, pain or happiness kinds of choices. And by making good choices, which means toward the side of growing up, love, spiritual growth, whatever you want to call that, lowering your entropy, we become more and more evolved. We grow. And as we make poor choices, we de-evolve. So us playing in this simulator is really the consciousness system's way of giving us a fast track to improve our evolution. And why would it do that? Well, because we're a part of it. And it is us, you see. So as we evolve, it evolves. And this larger consciousness system that I call it, of which we're a piece, it's just, it's not a supernatural thing. It's just a natural system. It's an information system. It is evolving. And it, like us, has the choice, evolve or die. If it de-evolves, eventually all the bits are random. There is no information. There is no information system. The information system is dead. So it has to continue to evolve. Otherwise, it'll de-evolve. And you can't just dither around in the middle long term. That's not stable. That's what's called astable. It can be stable for a short amount of time, but over the long term, it doesn't work that way, because the more you grow up, the easier it is to grow up more. The more you de-evolve, the easier it is to de-evolve more. So eventually, dithering around in the center will take you to one side or the other, which then will pull you more to that side than the other, and more, and pretty soon you either de-evolve and die, or you continue to evolve, you see. So that's kind of the choice, evolve or die. So here we are, and we have this innate sense at our core to grow, to become more, to be more than what we are now, to evolve ourselves, to evolve our quality. And we also know that we feel good, as you say, when we are helpful. We feel like we're doing the right thing. Yes, that's the right direction. Well, we kind of know this intuitively, that helping people, being kind to people, is a thing that is the right thing to do. Not because that will get you a win or get you gold stars on your chart, but because it's just the right thing to do. So we have that innate kind of sense. But as you say, by being nasty and by being self-centered and by being, arrogant and belligerent, you can end up with more marbles. That's the way it is. And the reason for that is that it takes a lot of effort to create, to grow. It takes effort to do that. But anybody can destroy very easily. Destruction, in other words, raising entropy rather than lowering it, going to the de-evolutionary side, that's easy. It's the easy choice. It's the quick choice. It takes a long time to build something, but you can take it down very quickly. You can destroy it very easily. So anytime you come to a choice, let's say you come to a fork in a road and there's a choice, and this is an important choice, there will be no more than one or two or three good answers, things you can do that are that will lower entropy and move you toward evolution. But there's thousands of things you can do that are bad answers, things that will be, take advantage of people, rip somebody off, use someone, that sort of things. There's just thousands of ways to do it wrong, but only a few ways to do it right. That's another way of looking at it. So you have to put effort in to growing up, to reducing your entropy. If you don't put that effort in, then you basically de-evolve by doing what's easy and what gets you ahead, and you can grab the stuff. But people who are evolved realize it's not about the stuff. It doesn't matter, how many cars are in your garage or how much money you have in the bank. It doesn't matter about that so much as it matters about what you're able to give. What can you give back? Not what you can get.
Yeah.
And it matters, you say people should learn that because it'll make their life better. People who are self-centered, people who are de-evolving, are unhappy people. Yes, they may act happy, okay, I got $1 million in the bank, I'm on top of the world and you can't touch me and all like that. But yeah, okay, if they just got it the day before, they'll feel pretty proud and pushed up by that. But you look at those people later, after they've had a chance to, settle into their good fortune. And you will find unhappy people for the most part. And research have shown, people who win lots of money in lotteries and things, in general, winning the lottery is not a great thing to have happen to you. Most of the people that win don't end up doing very well with it. It's not about the stuff you have. It's about what you do with that stuff, the choices you make. And if all of your choices are self-centered and self-focused and about you, you will be unhappy. You will be in pain. You will not feel satisfied. You will not feel like you're succeeding. So the people who are not caring, who are not giving and not loving, are miserable. And if you're going through life and it's a struggle, you're just struggling and struggling and struggling and can't ever seem to get to where you want to go. And that's because you run in your life out of your fear and your ego and your beliefs. Fear, ego, or I should say ego and beliefs are all generated by fear. So you're running your world, your life out of fear. Your choices are being made because of your fear, not because of your caring. And that will make you miserable and make you unhappy. And there's no way to get happy doing that other than maybe for a very short time. Long-term happiness requires you to give and to care and to be about other.
Right. Now, this is what I love about your model here, Tom, because you take the dogma, you take the good and evil, you take it all out of the equation, and it's just reduced to the simple logical fact that one way works and the other appears to work temporarily. And I often say in my work as a medium, you can't take your money with you after you die. You can't even take your body with you after you die. And the problem with a materialistic, self-centered point of view is there's a certain logic to it while you're here in the short term, but it doesn't take into account the larger reality, which is that there's more than just the physical world. And so you could also say that people who, well, when that revolution happens or is spontaneously triggered by those unsuspecting physicists, that maybe more people will start to wake up and go, wait a second, if there's more to reality, then why the hell am I so obsessed with what kind of car I drive or what kind of clothing I wear? Not to say that, because I also take umbrage with the new age woo-woo kind of philosophy that it's bad to have money. And then you wonder why all these spiritual people are poor. They're at war with it. I love what you just said. It's like, it's not about what you have. It's about what you do with it, where you're coming from. Are you coming from your center of being? That's like amazing.
Yeah. It's all about, what you are, not what you have. It's not even so much about what you do. You see, you can act kind and you can act loving and you can help little old ladies across the street and give to orphans and do all those things, but still be full of fear and ego and belief. Acting is not the same as being. Acting kind is more civilized, and certainly the people around you prefer it better. But what you need to do to grow up and evolve is be kind, be caring, and there's a big difference there. So you can't say, well, okay, gee, for the last 5 years, I've been acting really kind. I've, smile a lot. I'm happy to everybody. I, give to the charities. I help little ladies across the street. I'm the leader of a Boy Scout troop. I'm trying to do all these things, but still my life sucks and it's full of misery and I'm full of pain and I'm unhappy. That's because you're not being it. You're doing it. You're acting it. You're trying to be that way, but you're not really being that way. You see, you can't bluff your way through it. You can't act it. You have to really be it. You don't help the little old lady across the street because you think it's a nice thing to do and because you think that the people watching will think you're good and you'll be able to tell the story when you get to work about how you helped the little old lady and everybody will think you're a nice person. That's not why you do it. If you see somebody in distress that you can help, you just help them because that's what you are. It's not a matter of, oh, I think this would be a good thing to do, so I should go help her now. You don't think about it. You just are a good person and you help where you can. It doesn't require you to figure it out. It's you. It's the way you are at a deep level. So that's the thing. This growing up isn't about acting. And because a lot of people will say, well, I'm a good guy and I'm nice, but my life still sucks. Well, that's the difference between acting and being. It's your intent that matters, not so much what you do, not so much, what you have. Well, not at all what you have. It's about how much you care and how much you help. If doing good things is something you're doing because you think it'll make you get ahead in other people's eyes, it'll give you a good image, well, that's not going to help you grow up any. It may be helpful. It may be helpful to those other people, but it's not going to help you lower your entropy. It's not going to help you grow up. You really have to be it. And that is why it takes a while to grow up, because, being it, you have to really be committed.
It's a practice, right? And this is my last question for you. And please feel free to take as long as you want to answer it. I'm just blown away and so pleased to talk to you today. Thank you so much, by the way. My final question to you is, in all this time, in your research, have you developed or discovered any kind of strategies or tools to become love and to grow a little easier in today's world?
Sure. I have discovered a few of them that seem to work pretty well. For one, beliefs and fears are very hard to see. Oh, they're easy to see somebody else's. You can see somebody else's fears and their beliefs. That's trivial. Yeah, that's very obvious. Your own fears and beliefs are very opaque and very difficult to spot because, like we said earlier, you don't think you have beliefs. You think you have facts. And you don't think you have fears. You think you just run into annoying people, who make you angry and other sorts of things. You always can blame it on something else. So those two are really hard. So if you say, well, go, tear up your beliefs and your fears and get rid of them, most people don't have a clue because as far as they know, they really don't have fears or beliefs, either one. Or if they do, they can't really name them or get a hold of them. There's kind of nebulous thing. But ego is easy to spot. Ego is really easy to spot. Now, the way you spot ego is to look at your feelings. Do you ever feel anger? Do you ever feel upset? Do you ever feel used? Do you ever feel unappreciated? Do you feel unfulfilled? Now, I'm talking about negative things. Inasmuch as you have these negative experiences, negative feelings, that's your ego. If you didn't have that ego, you wouldn't feel those negative things. When that person comes up to you and says something that's rude to you, if you don't have an ego, you don't take it personally. It's not about you. You see it that it's about them. They don't understand or they don't know what's going on, and you have compassion for them in their ignorance because they're upset and they're angry, and that's because their ego is wound up around something, and you see if you can't maybe diffuse that or at least leave it alone, but it doesn't bother you because you are an authentic person. You know who you are and what you are and why you are, and it just, those kinds of things just roll off. They're not upsetting. They don't stress you. You see, so when you get stressed, when you get angry, it's because you do have ego. Now, your ego is only there because you have fear. That fear creates the ego. So once you find that you get a negative feeling, oh, that's, this thing really sucks, or that's terrible, or I don't like that person, or, that was a rude thing to say, and you're upset about it, you're angry about it, it wasn't fair, it wasn't nice, and so on. Well, if you're upset, it's because of your ego. Now, it may not have been nice, it may have been rude, that's true, but the fact that you're upset about it shows that you have ego. Now, doesn't most people have ego? Yeah, most people make all their choices, almost all their choices. Probably 90% of the choices people make are because of their fear, their ego, and their beliefs. That's where we are. We're not a very evolved species yet. We have a lot to learn, so that's normal that you are driven by your fear and your ego and your beliefs. It's the way we are. But you look at that ego, look at that negative feeling, trace it back to, why do I have this negative feeling? And when you do that, you have to take responsibility for it. You can't say, well, I'm upset, I'm angry because Susie said, that the work I handed in was trash. And that's why I'm angry, because that was good work and I spent a lot of time on it. Isn't telling me it's trash? Susie's a jerk, and she doesn't know what she's talking about. So you get angry because there's some part of you that is fearful that you're not really all that great, and that you're not all that adequate, and you have insecurity. And when somebody tells you your work is trash, it triggers all of that fear of being inadequate, not good enough, insecure, and you get angry because it triggers that fear. That fear is in denial. No, I'm not inadequate. Susie's a jerk. You see? So you blame, I'm angry because of Susie. You're not. You're angry because you have a fear, and Susie just plucked that fear and made it sing. And you are choosing to be angry because you have a fear. It's your choice. If you didn't have that fear and Susie told you that your work was trash, you'd say, "Oh, really? Why do you think so? Here, let's go look at it. Point out to me, what doesn't work here. I'd like to know, because maybe Susie will have something she can teach you. Maybe you'll learn something, or maybe all you'll learn is that Susie's confused and wouldn't know trash from good work, if she saw it. But that's okay. In either case, you have compassion for Susie because, she's angry too. Maybe your work was better than hers and she didn't get something. So that's why she's angry at you, you see. But none of that, all that's okay. You can let Susie be whoever she is. She can be full of anger. That's not your problem. That's Susie's problem. You see, you don't react to it with anger. So if you're angry, it's because you choose to be angry, not because Susie makes you angry. Take responsibility for your feelings. Find out where that anger comes from, trace it back to its fear, and now have the intention not to act better, not to pretend that you don't have that fear. So when Susie says that kind of thing to you anymore, instead of getting angry and slamming the door, you smile at her and say, well, if that's what you think, okay. So now you act like the nice person, but inside you're boiling, you're still angry, you see. That's not getting it. You have to find that fear and not cover it up or push it deeper down into your subconscious. You got to get that fear, and you have to really want to outgrow it, to get rid of it. And if you really want to, you will outgrow it. That's all it takes, is a real deep level intent to get rid of it. Because one of the things about our reality is that intent modifies future probability. And if you have an intention to get rid of that fear, and it's a really sincere being level intention, you will get rid of that fear. But if you only want to act better so that people will like you more, well, then that's not that deep level intention. Now it's all intellectual and it's all about acting. And then you won't. All you'll do is control that fear to where, rather than you going off in a rage, you'll do something else. You'll smile and whatever. You won't go into the rage outside, but you'll go into the rage inside, and that will be even worse. Because if there's anything worse than expressing your anger, it's not expressing your anger. That will eat at you and cause you more damage than expressing it. So all you've done is push the problem away where it will fester and get worse. So that is not a solution. You have to really want to get past it. You have to want to grow up. You have to want to become love and get rid of the fear. And if you do, you will find that the first fear is the hardest one to get rid of. The next one is easier. The next one is easier yet. And pretty soon you can throw these things off as soon as you get them, because most of these fears are just paper tigers. There's nothing there. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's like the wizards. You pull the curtain back and here's this little man and they're pulling levers and flashing lights. There's nothing really to it. And once you realize that these fears are things, attitudes that you got when you were 4 years old, and you've been carrying around ever since, because you didn't get the teddy bear and your siblings did. So therefore you must be unworthy. And now you felt unworthy, the rest of your life. Well, it wasn't about that at all. Your birthday was coming, 3 days later, and the presents were already been bought for you, but you don't see it that way. So as a 3 or 4 year old, so they turn out to be paper tigers, smoke, that once you face them and accept them and deal with them, you find out, geez, that was it. that was why I've been, inadequate all this time, because I didn't get the teddy bear.
And at
Gee,
war with people and
yeah,
making things personal. Now, this is really cool, really, really cool, because if you become a fear hunter, like you're suggesting, and use your inner exploration to seek out the source of your inadequacies, and essentially just by paying attention and knowing what they really mean, they sort of disappear. Yes, you get the long-term benefit of lowering your entropy and growing spiritually, but in the short term, you actually can become impervious to people attacking you.
sure. Once you get
Because,
rid of the fear, the attack is, you don't take it personally. It's
yeah,
not about you. You see, the only reason it's about you is because you have this fear that it might be true, that you might be the screw up, the inadequate person. You have that fear. Therefore, when somebody accuses you of something, you get angry because it hits home. You see, whereas if you don't have that and you're an authentic person who is real inside, then people give you that kind of stuff and it just brushes right by. It's not about you, it's about them. And then you see what you can do to help them grow up a little bit. And sometimes you can't help any other people grow up. Sometimes you just have to deal with people the way they are. And that's usually not all that hard once it doesn't get personal with you. You can, you can go over and be perfectly nice to them. And what that does is it helps them grow up, because they've just exploded at you, and you go over and pat them on the back and say, well, I hope you feel better tomorrow, hope tomorrow's a better day for you. Good luck. And you're not being sarcastic. You're not being, you're not being snide. You really mean it. They really feel that you aren't angry with them, and that will help them grow up, because they're used to throwing out this crap and getting crap back, and then you get in a crap war, with each other, and that makes you feel like, well, okay, I didn't get beat anyway. I'm okay.
it's like monkeys throwing feces at each other, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's something like that. So it's just a useless thing to do, but it keeps everybody stirred up in their fear. So you outgrow the fear, you get rid of it, and see, the point is that then your life is happy, because all this stuff that makes you unhappy now, it's not that you change all that necessarily at first. You still have all that stuff. You still live in too small a place. You still have, your dog still bites people. You still have all these issues and things to deal with, but now you can deal with them. You can deal with them because you don't get angry. It's not your own issues that cloud all the other issues into a big issue, stew that can never resolve itself because it never has any clarity. So you can start dealing with things, changing things, and pretty soon not only are you happier and you feeling like your life is good, you're making progress, but nothing bothers you. You stay happy all the time. You have joy in your life. You start being able to help people. Instead of fighting back, you find ways to help them. And then when they actually turn around and you become their best friend, well, you like that. It feels good. You see, so it makes you happy. So it's that sort of thing. It feeds. One thing feeds on another.
Do you have any grandchildren yet, Tom?
I have 8 grandchildren.
They're very, very lucky. I have to say that. Very lucky grandkids. I'm sure you play with them a lot and you encourage video games and stuff.
I was with them last night because it was Halloween. So I was out walking the streets last night with the grandkids.
That's
Absolutely
phenomenal. I have to just thank you so much for coming on my podcast. And I hope maybe when I do the TV show again and I'm in my studio, you'll have another call with me in the future.
Okay, sure. We can talk. That's what it's about. It's about sharing the information, right? If you learn something and you grow up and you get some aha moments, well, that's good. But sharing them with other people is even better, because now you give other people maybe some hope that there's something better than the treadmill that they seem to be stuck on now, or the misery and pain that they have. There is a way out, but it's not to force your way through it. It's to outgrow it, grow beyond it. So the pain doesn't exist. You don't have to change the outside world to find happiness and joy. You just have to change the inside world to find happiness and joy. It's not like I'd be happy if, my wife did this and my children did that, and the dog never barked at night, and, I didn't have a mortgage, and, you can go through all of this stuff. You know, and I had a Ferrari in the garage. You know, if I just had these things, I'd be really happy. Well, it's not the stuff, and that wouldn't make you happy. You'll always be struggling and unhappy and miserable because you don't have what you think you need. But if you just change what's inside of you, you don't have to change what's in the garage or what your kids do or your wife or anything else. Just change yourself. And if you change yourself, you'll find happiness just where you are, or you'll move on. You will gravitate to other places, other sets of friends, other connections, and you will find happiness because that's where you are. And you will attract that to yourself, and you will help generate it in others. So, yeah, the thing you have to change, and when you want to save the world, you start with yourself. Get your own mind straight, get rid of your fears, become as much like love as you can, and don't act like you're loving, but become it, be it. And that will be the greatest contribution you can make to making this world a better place, because this world is the way we make it. If you watch the news and you say, gee, this place sucks, everybody's trying to take advantage of everybody else, it's mean-spirited, it's just not a fun place to be, it's an accurate representation of us. We make it that way because that's the way we are. So that'll never change. You might think, oh, if we could just change that dictator, get rid of those politicians, you know, do this, do that, make all those people who are corporate CEOs, you know, kind and benevolent. If we could just change this stuff, everything would be great. It wouldn't work that way. If you don't change the people, it'll go right back to the way it was. Even if you do change all those leadership positions, 20 years later, it'll be right back to the way it was. It won't change, or 50 years later, however it takes to regress to its normal state. Its normal state is a reflection of us, who we are. Because we modify future probability, that's one way we influence the reality we live in. So if you think the world sucks, well, it's because we, as a species, are creating this sucky world. And the only way we can change it is if we grow up. But you can't make anybody else grow up. Growing up has to be done from the inside out, not from the outside in. So the only person you can grow up is yourself. So that's where you start. And when you do that, you actually help other people grow up too, because we're all netted, all consciousness is netted. And as you grow up, you'll help pull others up. As they grow up, they'll help pull you up. And as you get meaner and grow down and de-evolve, you'll pull others down and make them meaner and de-evolve. So we're all in the boat together, and the only person we can change is ourselves. So the answer of what to do next is rather obvious. You know, there's only really one thing to do, and that is start working on that fear and getting rid of it. Start taking responsibility for your feelings. And anytime you want to see how I'm doing, you want to look at the growth meter, just look at yourself for a couple of weeks. Look at your feelings. Look at all your feelings. Are they full of joy and happiness and peace, and you feel satisfied, or are they full of misery and pain and, you know, discomfort and annoyance and anger? Well, that'll tell you where you are. That's, you know, if you want to know how many gold stars are next to your name, you know, whether you're really doing well or whether you really got a long way to go, all you got to do is just look at your feelings for a little bit. Be honest with yourself. Don't stuff things away where you can't see them. And that will be an accurate assessment of where you are on this path.
Phenomenal.
So, you know, so make the assessment, do the work, change it. Change yourself, not your actions. Your actions will change by themselves once you change. So that's kind of the summary of where it is. You know, I'm all about physics, right? And I'm a physicist and about the science, but the science really isn't the big issue. The main issue here is about growing up and lowering entropy. And the reason that science is important is I see science as the thing that's going to help a whole lot of people grow up when they validate that this is a virtual reality, which is what their experiments are telling them, because that says there's something bigger, non-physical to us, something more fundamental than us, which will open up this. Well, then who are we? Why are we here? What is this simulation that I'm a character in? And as we start to think those thoughts, the structure of reality hopefully will start to pull together for a lot of people, and they'll end up with the same logic that I ended up with, and that is love is the answer. That's why we're here. So if we get that going, then shoot, this place may be a totally different world, 3 decades from now. Hard to say. But humanity's never been at the point where it could actually do this before. We couldn't. We didn't. It always was local. Some guy like Buddha figures it out, or some guy like Gandhi figures it out. Martin Luther King, or who was it, Mandela. These people who are grown up, they figure it out, but they only influence a small patch around themselves. And
it's because those podcast guys weren't around yet.
That's true. You see, exactly. There were no podcasts. There was no internet. Now the world is a smaller place. Now news travels quickly. Understanding travels quickly. And that makes all the difference in the world. That's why Gandhi was more than just a guy who helped the British go home. He's everybody in all the countries all around the world know his name. You see, that's because we had TV then. We had radio, and then we had TV, and we had things that spread these words around. Well, now we've got internet, and internet finally is going to allow, when the physicists say, yea, verily, this is a virtual reality, then that's going to be news all over the world. That there is something larger, non-physical to us that's more fundamental. And the scientists are telling us that, so we can believe it's true because the high priests have just checked that box. That's going to be a very big thing. If just I say that, or you say that, or some preacher says that, yeah, right, we've heard that before. But when the scientists tell us, we'll believe it. And when we believe it, and it's all over the world because we have an internet, now we have a chance to actually do something as a species that we didn't have before. So this is a new ball game that's never existed since the humans jumped out of the trees. We've never had this opportunity like we have now. Now, we may not do it in the next 2 or 3 decades, but we will do it eventually, because our evolution is steady. Evolution is relentless. Evolution doesn't quit. It's just an open-ended process that keeps chugging toward where it has to go. With consciousness, where it has to go is low entropy. Low entropy means being love, kindness, caring. That's where it's going. So you may go backwards for a while, but eventually we will get there. So it's not, will we ever get there? Yes, we will, because evolution is an endless thing that just keeps chugging. It never quits. How long will it take? Well, we don't know. But now we have an opportunity to make big changes in attitudes worldwide. We've seen some of it happen, but the high priests, who are the scientists who tell us what to believe, you see, haven't been really on board with these changes. It wasn't the scientists that got really wowed by Gandhi and Mandela, and Martin Luther King.
Right.
That was kind of outside their thing. So the high priests now, when they tell us that there's something non-physical that's more fundamental, that's going to ring a bell, and it's going to start something going that'll probably take a century before it works itself out. But it could end up being really, really nice if we don't get stuck in someone else trying to grab that power, because there's going to be a big power vacuum then.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're not materialists, well then who's in charge? What's that? And you're going to have, whenever there's a power vacuum, you'll have all the negatives, people trying to say, oh, I'm the center of I'm the power here. And there'll be a lot of power grabbing going on. But I hope by then the people are smart enough to ignore that and let that go and say, no, there's something bigger than that. We're onto something that's more than, what you're selling us. We're not going to go backwards into, the bad old days where the religious high priest told everybody what was right. We're going to move forward to a time where, metaphysics and physics becomes all one thing. where philosophy and science are reunited again in an understanding of the world, rather than philosophy's over here. Those are the people that just talk but never get anything done. And now you have the science on the other place where, they get everything done. They build neat gadgets for us. So philosophy's kind of the science is the real thing. And it won't be like that. We'll see that science has a philosophy, and that philosophy can be bigger than materialism. Suddenly it embraces everything. So all of these things that are split apart can come together. You don't have the atheists and the theists that are on opposite sides. The atheists can say, see, I knew it all along. There was no supreme being that is, the big granddaddy playing with his pet people. And the theists can say, yeah, see, I knew it all along. There was this larger non-physical system that was the cause and the root of everything. And that love is the answer.
Yeah.
You see, they both win. You see, it's not, there's nobody's excluded in this game. Everybody can see that we're all connected. We're all part of one thing. It's not science and philosophy and atheists and theists.
Right.
It's all comes together as one big thing. We're all a piece of it, all a part of it. And as much as anybody is hurting, we're all hurting.
Mm.
You see, we're all shared in this. So once we get that idea that we're here to grow up and care and give, then we'll have made it. This place will really get, and all our institutions and our politicians and our corporations, they'll all just change with us. As we change, they'll change.
Yep.
We become kinder and gentler, they'll become kinder and gentler. They're just a reflection of us, including our politicians and other things. That'll all change by itself. You don't have to chop any heads off there. It'll all fix itself.
It's all a reflection, isn't it? It's like a matter mirror, I call it. So I'll put links to your website as well as your book trilogy, because I'm sure everyone's going to want to read it and get a hold of it after this, because it's just phenomenal. And I just, again, thank you so much for doing this on such short notice.
You are very welcome. I just had an opening and you just happened to be there wanting one. So we made a match, and here we are, hopefully shed some news that people can use.
Thank you so much again. Have a wonderful day.
Okay, so long.